Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is episode 30 of Bible Mechanics, and we're talking about how the Bible is put together, how it came together, how it was formed, how it's been enhanced over the years. Not that any of the content's been changed, but features have been added, like chapters and verses and things like that, that have made it easier to navigate the Bible, either easier to find your way around and understand what it actually says. You know, what it says is what it says from the very first time the words were put to parchment or papyrus, as the case might be. So last time I was talking with you about the Bible development timeline, and we started with the 15th century BC when Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then we walked our way up through, I think we got to the 14th century, which would be the 1300s. That can be confusing a lot of times, but, you know, like if Jesus began ministry when he was about 30 years old, and that would have been, you know, in the 30s AD, that was the first century, and that would go up to 99, and then it would go to 100, but that would be in the 2nd century. So if it's 100s, that means it's the 2nd century. If it's the 1300s, it means it's the 14th century. So that's when John Wycliffe translated the Bible from Latin into English, and that was the first time the Bible had appeared in English. And he translated it from Latin rather than the original Greek because Jerome had translated the Hebrew and Greek Bible in the 5th century to Latin, and Latin was the primary language of the Roman Empire at that time, or was becoming so. It had been the lingua franca of the world had been Greek before that. So John Wycliffe in England translates the Bible into English, and so that was a great milestone. It was in the 15th century, about the middle of the 15th century, that the printing press was invented. And so everything up to this point had been handwritten. They're manuscripts. So the original was handwritten. And every copy that was made, was handwritten. It was only when Gutenberg, I still could have it wrong, invented the printing press in, 1445, 1450, somewhere in there. And from that came modern books with their binding and paper. But prior to that, we had the Codex, which was very much like a book, but you didn't have the same strength of binding, and it just looked much more primitive. But they were all handwritten, and a lot of times on papyrus or parchment. And then in the period before Christ, it had primarily been scrolls. And there still were scrolls in the time of Christ up till about the 4th or 5th century, when the Codex became dominant. There were still some scrolls after that, but that's where the dominance of the Codex came in. Then the 16th century, which was the century of the Protestant Reformation, began. William Tyndale translates the New Testament into English from the original Greek. He had also worked on a translation of the Old Testament, was unable to complete it before he was martyred. He was killed at the stake. He was to be burned, but they ended up, they made it a little less, not so torturous a death for him. I don't know how maybe they broke his neck or something like that. But that's the kind of thing that got him into trouble, was translating it into English. Now, the English already had the Latin, but this Greek created a great sense of excitement in Europe and in England. And it was because the text could be much more faithful to the original, which is why I like the New American Standard Bible so much. because its goal is to be as faithful to the original as possible, as close to what the text actually said. And we'll probably do another one of these videos on the translations. And it was also in the 16th century that the verse divisions were added. Chapter divisions were added back in the 13th century, and the verse divisions came 300 years later. So there's a lot going on in the 16th century. William Tyndale translates the New Testament from Greek into English. The Protestant Reformation takes place, or begins, and then the verse divisions of the Bible come about. The 17th century, we get the King James Bible. 1611, the King James Bible was published, and it has continued to be published ever since, named after King James I of England. Then in the 19th century, we're going to jump from the 17th to the 19th, Tischendorf discovers Codex Sinaiticus. I think it was a count or something, but Tischendorf discovered this codex. It was one that came from the 4th century. I think it was parchment, and you can view the contents online. just do an online search on Codex Sinaiticus. It was called that because of where it was found. I think it was found near Mount Sinai. That was in 1844. So that was a big event, and it's pretty neat to see that that back in the Codex Sinaiticus would have been put together in the 4th century. That was the first century in which the codex technology was developed enough to put the whole Bible into one codex. So a lot going on back in the 4th century. In 1881, Professors Westcott and Hort first published their critical text, which was examining all the ancient manuscripts and trying to pick which ones were deemed to be the closest to the original. And then in 1899, that's when we first got Bibles with red letters in it. So, like these red letters from Matthew. Sorry for all my scratching and underlining, note-taking, but you can see the red there. And let me read you the story of how that happened. Not all Bibles have red letters, but those that do use them for the words of Jesus. More precisely, they are for the words Jesus spoke during his earthly life and afterward when he ascended into heaven. Therefore, there are no red letters in the Old Testament. When a Bible has red letters, they're all in the New Testament. There are, of course, lots of them in the 4 Gospels, but there are only a few in the books that follow, with most of them found in Acts and Revelation. Paul's letters, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and 1 Timothy, contain the others. Even though the New Testament texts have existed for 2,000 years, it's only in the last 100 years or so that the words of Jesus have been presented in red. In an 1899 Christian Herald magazine editorial, German-American publisher Louis Klopsch declared and promoting the idea as being inspired by Jesus' words at the Last Supper. And he quotes Luke 22:20. And in the same way, he took the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup, which is poured out for you, is the new covenant in my blood." All those Old Testament sacrifices had been in the blood of animals. This was the first time that God would receive a human sacrifice and accept the blood of a human being, which was because he was the sacrifice chosen for all of our sins. It goes on to say here, thus the red letters are intended to remind us of the blood Jesus shed on the cross for our sins. That is indeed something worth remembering. It cost Jesus something precious to come to earth and tell us the truth. Klopsch was an associate of 19th century Protestant luminaries such as Thomas DeWitt Talmage, Dwight L. Moody, and Ira D. Sankey. The first red letter New Testament was published later in 1899, and the first such full Bible in 1901. And then that brings us to the 20th century, when the New American Standard Bible was first published. It is generally considered the English translation that adheres the closest to a literal word-for-word translation from the original language. Other noteworthy literal translations are the King James Version from 1611 and the English Standard Version, which I think was in the 2000s, was the first version, but if it wasn't, it was the late 1900s. New American Standard, I think the first edition was published in 1960, and that was based on a previous edition from the turn of the century before that, called the American Standard Version, and that was basically because King James used British English and the American Standard Version, and then later the New American Standard used English in the American way. So that from the website, and you can find this there, Bible Study Notes, History of the Bible. You can search for it, and that's kind of an overview of how long it took. I mean, that's a total period of 3,500 years. We started with the 15th century BC, and here we are in the 21st century. And so the Bible has been enhanced and improved, but not changed in all that time to help us better understand it. God bless you, and see you next time.